Excellent, thank you. We are kind of modestly proud of that little film, and I hope it conveys a kind of a sense of the energy and the enthusiasm that there is in the Arctic community here in the UK to carry forward this kind of research. And so I hope that gives you a kind of a sense of what kind of some of the issues that there are. So let's go into some of this in more detail now. So I'll talk a bit about the context, kind of a few slides about the particular changes that we're seeing in the Arctic, something about the United Kingdom and the Arctic, international approaches, and then some of those science to policy challenges. This is an image here on the screen in front of you of our research station, the UK's research station in Ny-Ålesund in Norway, Svalbard, that was mentioned in the film. The most important thing to remember when you think about the Arctic is that it is not a blank canvas. It is very much an inhabited, lived, economically active, populated part of the world. So there are 4 million people that live north of the Arctic Circle, many of them in quite significant cities, Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, Tromsø, just kind of to name just a few. And at least 10% of that 4 million population are indigenous communities, indigenous rights holders, First Nation, Inuit communities, and others are kind of across the whole of the Arctic. So it is a claimed, a governed, a lived space. And that slightly complicated image on the right-hand side there, I hope gives you a sense of that. So all the bits that are coloured are the bits that are either someone's existing territory, the 8 Arctic states, or they're parts that could be claimed by those 8 Arctic states, the continental shelf, or territorial, or kind of 200 nautical mile limits. So there's very little in the Arctic that's essentially unclaimable. It's not to say there aren't parts that are relatively untouched or relatively unspoiled, to use that kind of that old-fashioned term. But the majority of the Arctic is either claimed or claimable. And of course it's going through rapid and disproportionate warming. So you can see that part circled top right there in red. That's the Arctic equator in the middle and Antarctic down below. So the Antarctic is warming kind of gradually but in pulses, and it's kind of very regional in the Antarctic. The equator is gradually warming over time. You can see that kind of progression from left to right. But in the Arctic, that change is dramatic and it's profound, and it's been happening significantly since the mid-1990s, 2000s. And that's a feedback loop. The more the Arctic warms, the more it feeds back to the rest of the globe. The more the rest of the globe warms, the more it feeds back to the Arctic. The Arctic is essentially the air conditioning system of the planet, and that air conditioning system it looks like it's beginning to fail. And although no one knows what the consequences of that will be in detail, the fact that there will be some consequences seems beyond doubt. And it's clear that sea ice loss is probably driving environmental change more generally. This image on the right-hand side with the blue line that you can just about see was taken is an image from a couple of days ago, the 19th of June, and it's a representation of Arctic sea ice extent. So areas of ocean with at least 15% sea ice. So that's not actually that much. 15% is not much in any area. It was tracking very far below the previous minimum, which was the dotted line you can see there, until relatively recently, until June. And its rate of decline is kind of not quite at the rate of decline as it was in 2012. But the decline in sea ice is inexorable and dramatic. And sea ice loss is, or appears to be, directly linked to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So different models will predict different things, and some of the models aren't great at matching the observations for what's actually happened. So if you look back, some of the models won't kind of demonstrate, you can't prove from the models that exactly what has been observed is kind of tracked in that model. But what does seem to be a correlation, or potentially a causal link here, is the link between sea ice loss and carbon dioxide. And the image to take away, I think, here is that it's 3 meters squared of sea ice per tonne of CO2. A tonne of CO2 is roughly a return flight from London to Washington and back, Washington DC. So each flight is 3 meters square of sea ice less. This is interesting findings from CPOM, joint work between the UK and the US. And the other thing to bear in mind, apart from the science, is this is a world with an enormous quantities of international bodies who take an interest in this part of the world. If you think about Antarctica, there are kind of a large number of bodies too that have an interest, but the Arctic particularly, because it is that politically lived, claimed, economic, social active space. There are many organisations that have a role in Antarctica and in the Arctic, and to some extent have a science, a research, a policy aspect there. So I won't go into any of these other than to kind of recognise that there are a large number of bodies and partners that are capable of funding research in the Arctic, but also are consumers of research in the Arctic. So that's a bit about the context, and there's some context in the film as well. So what about the United Kingdom and the Arctic? Why does the Arctic matter to the UK? It's all about proximity, essentially. When you think about how close we are the Arctic's closest neighbour. People talk about parts of Scotland being closer to the Arctic Circle than they are to London. And that's clearly true. When you think about migrating birds, when you think about the currents, when you think about the Gulf Stream, when you think about shipping and the routes that there might be in the Arctic in the future, you think about the transfer of pollution, kind of both kind of from the Arctic and to the Arctic, then all of this matters to the UK. And it matters particularly to the research community, because we, the UK researchers, many of you here, have got good at Arctic research. And although we are the nearest neighbour, you wouldn't necessarily expect us to be as good at Arctic research as we are and as productive. But the UK is the fourth in the world when it comes to the volume, the number of Arctic-related publications. So that's way beyond Sweden and Denmark and Norway, probably. So we are a really big Arctic player when it comes to the amount of research that's carried out, and that makes us desirable partners for international work. And when it comes to the impact of those, the citation references for those publications, we're sixth. So we don't quite match the fourth, but we're still kind of up there, and we're a really big player when it comes to Arctic research. So the Arctic matters to the UK in social, environmental terms, but it matters a lot to the research community as well. And that's recognised within the UK's Arctic policy framework. This is a document created by the Foreign Office, Polar Regions Department, when I was in it back in 2013, and it's the first policy that there is essentially about the UK and the Arctic. And the important thing to take away from this slightly busy slide is about how science kind of runs all the way through it. So the respect, the leadership, the cooperation, all of that is because of science and is delivered through science. So science is the golden thread that runs through the UK's kind of approach, whole policy approach when it comes to the Arctic. And NERC is investing heavily in Arctic research. There is no doubt about that, and has recently, or over the course of the last 6-7 years, invested heavily in strategic programs, so programs dedicated to Arctic research. The most recent of these, the first of these, was the NERC Arctic Research Programme, which ran for 5-6 years, 2010 to 2016. And that was looking at a whole range of issues to do with change in the Arctic Ocean. It was looking at understanding why the Arctic is changing so quickly, looking at the processes for methane release from the permafrost, both on land and at sea, and carbon dioxide release, looking at uncertainty in those predictions. If you want to know how the Arctic is going to change, you've got to predict what's going to happen. You've got to deploy your models and your observations and see what is changing. And then look at the potential risk of what they call submarine hazards. So submarine undersea landslides, and we'll come on to that in just a second. So that was a big program, 9 main projects, a number of other associated projects kind of wrapped in around it, involving lots of universities and partners across the UK and lots of other international partners at the same time. That was all coordinated and delivered by the projects and the universities themselves, but coordinated from the Arctic office where we work in Cambridge. What we've been doing since then is kind of making sure that those findings are translated effectively as possible to policymakers. So some of them are relatively discrete scientific findings, and it's important the scientific community and others know about those. In other places, there are kind of direct policy consequences from that research that's been carried out, and we'll come on to that a little bit more. So there is a new NERC programme, the Changing Arctic Ocean programme, which will run from 2017 to 21. It's not a direct successor to the Arctic Research Programme, but it's in that series, and it's looking at the specific biogeochemical changes that are happening in the Arctic Ocean. So it's looking at the changing ecosystem, and that has an implication for fish and kind of other resources, other resources that the fish kind of exist in an ecosystem with changing. Are they moving? What will happen as the ocean warms and desalinates? And as those species potentially move north, and that frozen central area of the Arctic Ocean begins to open up. And that field work is beginning to start very soon on the NERC ship, the James Clark Ross, which is one of the big science ships you saw in the film. And that will be going into the Barents Sea, that big sea north of Norway, with lots of the science teams on board, and they'll be beginning that work, well, kind of a couple of weeks' time, they'll begin to go out from Tromsø. So the UK is investing heavily in this, and this is just the strategic programs. when you look at the smaller individual grants, there's much more that wraps around this. And as I said, kind of it's all about really the dissemination, the promotion, and the impact of this work for us. So we're not the ones that deliver this work, we're not the ones that publish the findings, but we are the ones, hopefully, that encourage, empower, fund a little bit the researchers to make sure that their findings get out into the wider world. So the image there on the left-hand side is from a series of booklets that we did about key findings from this work, mostly aimed at a scientific audience, but perhaps not an Arctic purist scientific audience, so people could see what was coming out of these 9 and more projects and what the links would be to people's own work. We have a UK Arctic Science Conference every couple of years. The next one is in Oban in September 2017, 19th to the 21st of September, and we'll use that as an opportunity to promote the work of this programme and beyond. And I'm hoping by then we will have a dedicated publication, something quite small, but that's written explicitly for policymakers in central government in Whitehall, because you can't expect them, or they're not going to read something that's more than kind of a dozen, 20 pages long. It has to be deliberate and specific, and it has to be tailored to their job. So it has to say, if you work in marine safety, this is what you need to know. If you work in civil contingency secretariat thinking about disasters, this is what you need to know. If you work on fisheries, then this is what you need to know. And it has to be as specific as that. And I hope when it comes to that conference in Oban, we'll have that ready, and we'll have a specific event in London, just down the road from Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department, to make sure that people hear this message. And so let's talk about one of the specific projects that was funded under that Arctic research program, and it was called Tsunami, and it was led from University of Durham and other locations, and it was about the potential for climate change to create subsea landslides. And there was a very famous landslide, or has been a famous landslide called the Storegga slide, which was over 8,000 years ago north of Norway, and it was an enormous kind of landslip, subsea landslip, which created a very large tsunami effect across large parts of the Arctic, depositing material kind of 8-9 meters, or kind of a tsunami wave 8-9 meters high on the Scottish mainland, depositing material way up on the mainland. And so there was some thought about whether this kind of thing becomes much more likely if you have warming seas, a changing climate in the future. So part of that work that was funded through the Arctic Research Programme was to investigate that. As it turns out, seems to be insufficient evidence at the moment to suggest that landslide frequency will increase as the ocean warms, but that equally the previously thought periodicity of those landslides of 100,000 years or so can't be stood up. It's likely that it may be more regularly than that. And so that's something where there was quite an esoteric specialist piece of research, and that's now been translated through into policy. So that's now, as I understand it, on the UK National Risk Register, maintained by the Cabinet Office, to make sure that that risk is people are aware of that, and it feeds into policy in whatever way is appropriate. This is the last slide for the kind of the UK element of the presentation, and it's about making the links on the biggest stages. So the World Economic Forum meets in Davos every year, usually in January, and you may have seen this on the television this year. But there was an Arctic base camp created there in Davos by the University of Lancaster and others to try and bring home to the policymakers the economic consequences of change within the Arctic. So it's not just polar bears and walruses and indigenous communities, but it's about what the bigger social impact and environmental economic costs will be of that kind of change. And the figure you can see, I'm sorry it's very kind of slightly faint here, but the figure second from left on the bottom there is Al Gore, Vice President Al Gore, who was speaking along with Cristina Figueres from the UNFCCC. And this was on the margins of Davos. This is kind of Davos fringe, if you like. And on one level, it's an enormous undertaking, costs a lot of money, but actually you are connecting to a very large number of influential policymakers. And that's something that we think is really, really important. That wasn't funded by us in the Arctic office, but we helped to kind of support it in whatever way we could. And we hope that this kind of thing there'll be more of that in the future. Because if you reach those policymakers in Davos, then you are reaching the people that decide what individual countries' emissions targets will be when it comes to greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. And if you make a difference there, then you're making a difference to that chart that shows the relationship between sea ice loss and carbon dioxide levels. So I think increasingly this kind of thing, judged appropriately, will be more and more important. Let's talk about international. So it's important to know about the Arctic Council when it comes to international work, because the Arctic Council is the preeminent body that looks at things that aren't security and defence or sovereignty or trade, but that are social, environmental in the Arctic. And it has the 8 Arctic states, the 6 permanent participants, which are essentially the groups of indigenous communities and rights holders across the Arctic, and then it has state observers, including the UK. And it's where the countries come together to bring together knowledge and expertise on particularly the Arctic environment, but also social issues as well. The UK has been engaged since 1996, since the very start, and we've been actively engaged in all those meetings. As an observer, you literally get to observe. So this is a meeting of the Arctic states themselves. They are the ones who decide. Everything is by consensus. The observers observe, and you participate in the technical working groups. You don't get to decide what actually happens in the meeting itself. But nevertheless, it's an important activity. These are some of the things that the Arctic Council wants to do. It's about a peaceful Arctic, the Arctic as a home, a prosperous Arctic, a safe Arctic, a healthy Arctic, Arctic knowledge, and of course a strong Arctic Council. And this is quite technical, so forget the titles, but just look at the bullet points here. All the things that the Arctic Council working groups are looking at are all the kinds of things that in the UK we're quite good at looking at. About pollutants, about mercury, black carbon, changes in the ocean, ecosystems, marine, Arctic shipping, oil spill response, human health, cultural heritage. The UK has a huge in to all these working groups. And so one of the jobs we have in the Arctic office is to try and make sure we link up the right UK people into these groups and support them as best we can to take part. And these are examples of some of the things that the Arctic Council Working Group does. This is all about black carbon, persistent organic pollutants, methane in the Arctic. And it's a kind of an extremely productive system that produces a lot of material. And it needs to be productive because these are some of the human impact changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. Some of these changes happen naturally. It's about kind of the natural life of buildings, but in other cases, it's about the permafrost thawing and the kind of the strata beginning to be kind of soft and weak. It's about coastal erosion because the floating sea ice that's normally there in the winter has broken up, and so storms which would normally be absorbed by the sea ice are coming into land and eroding the land. And these are really significant changes across really big swathes of the Arctic, in Alaska, in Canada, and particularly in Arctic Russia. And this is important in that kind of the Arctic Council has been going for kind of 20 years, just over, since 1996. The initial worry was we don't know enough about what's happening in the Arctic, so we need to monitor it. So the monitoring was the first thing. We need to get kind of recorders in, we need to know more about what's happening. And then once you know a little bit more about what's happening, then you think about what the assessment is. What does it mean? We know this thing, but now what does it actually mean? Kind of, what's the effect of that? And increasingly, the expectation is that the Arctic Council will move to action, implementation. So we've measured it, we know what it means, and now we need to respond to it in practical ways. And this document on the right there is all about adaptation actions for a changing Arctic. So there are 3 of these produced for the Arctic region, roughly covering the inhabited Arctic. And it's about what the Arctic states and others need to do to respond to the changes that they're seeing in the Arctic. And this is very much kind of a good example of how science is feeding into the kind of policy changes that everyone needs to see in the Arctic. We're coming to the end. Science Cooperation Agreement. So the Arctic Council has been in operation for over 20 years. It's only ever achieved 3 legally binding agreements on search and rescue, on oil spill response, both of which very important. And then the last one, which was signed in May this year, on science cooperation. So this is about recognising that there are unhelpful barriers between the Arctic states in working and cooperating on science engagement. And in unspoken terms, this is all about Russia. It's all about the difficulty of doing research in Russia. It's about the importance of the permafrost system in Russia and knowing more about it. So little isn't about permafrost, but none of that is in the IPCC assessments. So all the methane that's coming out of the permafrost, all the carbon dioxide release, none of that is factored in because no one can trust the figures enough. So it's all about working in Russia. And this photograph here was taken at the ministerial meeting. That's Rex Tillerson in the middle, and to his right, our left, is Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. So he was there, he was signing this cooperation agreement. And that's a really good sign for the future, because despite all the difficulties in Russia, despite all the difficulties in the US, this is something that actually is really positive. And we'll be using this as a hook to make sure that when we talk to Russians and Canadians and others in the Arctic about collaboration, then we can say, you signed this agreement. As a UK, we're not an Arctic state, we're not directly related to this, but there are clauses in here saying these benefits can be extended to observers, and we are an observer and we'd like to participate. So that's a good hook for us. Just a couple more slides. As we know more about the science in the Arctic, as the questions get bigger, conversely, the response to those questions need to be bigger as well. And this is something that's coming up in the future. It's called Mosaic, the International Arctic Drift Expedition. And it's about freezing in the German icebreaker, the Polar Stern, into the Arctic Ocean, a bit like the drift that Nansen did kind of over 100 years ago. So they'll freeze it into the Russian Arctic at the top of the red dots on the slide here, and it will drift with a natural current over the course of a year until it pops out around Svalbard, Franz Strait area. And this is the kind of really big international science that the UK, hopefully in the future, will be part of. And it's about ground truthing some of the things that we get from satellites and remote sensing to make sure that the things you think you know about Arctic sea ice in the middle of winter, when it's dark, it's cold, inaccessible, actually you do genuinely know and are true on the ground, because we'll have people there in the middle of the night on that ship in the Arctic. And it's, in a way, it's a slightly old-fashioned way, although they'll be using very new technology, AUVs, drones, helicopters, all kinds of things. So as an example of where some of the science is going in the future, yes, it's going into automated activity and more satellite sensing, but also it's going into some of these big, in a way old-fashioned, but actually very modern new approaches too. And the UK, we hope, will be a big part of that. This is the very last slide, and so I won't dwell on it, but there are things that we might talk about here when it comes to kind of a panel session or questions later. And some of these are kind of, is the Arctic environment changing more quickly than scientists and policymakers can respond to it? What's the appetite for turning increasingly what we know and what we know that knowledge means in the Arctic into practical, expensive, difficult, unpopular action, both here and in the Arctic itself? And the balance between study of change in the Arctic itself and the impact that the Arctic has on other people, on kind of mid-latitudes, on the globe more generally. And then the final one here, provocative, as we leave the EU, how do we stay connected to these international mechanisms? The UK does brilliantly out of those international connections and research mechanisms, and it's desperately important that in whatever way it's decided, we do our best to make sure we stay within that. So thank you very much. That's my email address, that's our Twitter handle in the middle, and our website. Please do kind of have a word, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. We have an Arctic Office bulletin that goes out monthly. If you'd like to be on that, just let me know, send me an email, and we'll get you added on. Thank you.